Hey beautiful people, welcome back to Angelic Embrace, where we document and narrate the glorious and life-changing near-death experiences sent in by you guys. It is greatly appreciated. So sit back, relax, know that you are loved, and let's get into today's near-death experience story. Consider subscribing and watching to the end to find out what happens. I had a lung collapse in 1994 when I was 18 years old, and I was hospitalized as a result of it. The only obvious explanation for this was that I had a cold at the time, and I had a history of asthma. A little over a month later, when I had been back at home for about a month, I had a dream that I was standing on the edge of a cliff when I suddenly plummeted off of it. When I finally did land, I got the sensation that my breathing had stopped completely. Instantaneously, the idea occurred to me, if I landed in my dream, then I must have died. The instant that I made impact in the dream, everything turned completely dark. At that time, I realized that I hadn't been dreaming about it. I found myself drifting about in a pitch-black void. I was terrified during that time since I couldn't see anything around me. At that moment, perhaps 1 or 2 seconds had passed since the floating had begun. A voice so loud that I could just make out the words said, "I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and end." At that very instant, I became aware of a light approaching me from the right side of my body. At first, it was quite a distance away, but as time passed, it inched closer and closer until it completely engulfed me in light. At that point, all I could see was light and feel warmth. After that, I heard a voice call my name and introduce itself to me as Jim, which is not my given name. The light then assumed the form of what seemed to me to be the silhouette of Jesus, quite similar to how the Shroud of Turin would seem to someone looking at it. At that moment, I made some sort of statement. Whether it was vocal or by means that were nonverbal is difficult to say at this point. Nonetheless, I get the impression that it was verbal. I inquired, "Am I dead?" Because I had such a strong intuition about the matter, I didn't even bother to wonder if it really was Jesus. In the presence of the light or shape of him, I had feelings of love and calm. At that time, I inquired of him as to why I was referred to as Jim, yet my name is not Jim. Jesus said that there had been a mistake, and that it was not yet his time. During that split second, or for that split second, I thought they must have mistaken who they were looking for and phoned them up. But then, something forced me to ponder whether or not there is reincarnation, and if there is, whether or not I had been reincarnated, and if so, who was I in a previous life? Jesus told me that there is a life beyond death and that I had a previous incarnation, but that this is not the most important thing. After that, I inquired as to whether or not I was Jim Morrison, the lead vocalist for the band The Doors, for some reason. Something that I had a very little familiarity with of him prior to the NDE, thus I now find it strange that it happened. When I think back on it now, it seems as though the questions were planted in my mind intentionally so that Jesus might reply to them. He reacted by saying that it was true, but that it didn't matter since reincarnation isn't what we think it is. At that moment, I had the impression that we were engaging in more of a nonverbal kind of communication due to the quick rate at which I was gaining information. It was explained to me that even though we have the ability to be reborn, our souls do not change, we only take on new bodies. However, it is not necessary to concentrate on who I was in the past because I still have the same soul. After that, I inquired as to whether or not I might remain, but I was informed that I had to go since it was not my time. When I heard that Jesus had a really relaxing and soothing impact, I changed my mind about staying away from the church and decided to return. I then asked, if I were to go back, when would I return again? And Jesus responded by saying that there would be 2 ages that I could come back, one of either 37 or 73, and that I would have a heart attack at 37, but that it was uncertain still if I would be called home, but if I want to it would be because I was given 10 more years than I had in my previous life. You would think that anything like this would have troubled me, but it didn't since it wasn't frightening at all. After that, I inquired as to when the end of the world will occur, to which Jesus said that only the Father is aware of the precise time and hour. Aside from the love of Jesus and the fact that I was assured I would return, I don't recall much else from that time period. Then I had the sensation of my spirit returning to my body, which was positioned in the bed. As my spirit returned to my body, I had the impression that I was sinking through a mucky or quicksand-like substance. I ended up sleeping the remainder of the time, and looking back, I can honestly say that it was definitely one of the most restful nights I've ever had. Okay, now that I've given you that narrative, I'd want to talk about the person who I've been told I am. The reason for this is that I am absolutely positive in my knowledge that what was said was the truth. My actions throughout my life have now added up, and for the past 9 years, I've been struggling with the realization that I now know who I was. When I was a little child, between the ages of 3 and 4, I used to dance like a Native American and spin around in circles in the living room until I was so dizzy that I almost passed out. I am not of Native American descent, thus there was no way for me to learn these dances. I've learned a lot about Jim Morrison over the past 8 years, including the fact that he considered himself to be a shaman and performed dances and circle motions on stage. I also discovered this information. I went to see a psychic, and she told me that in her vision, I was standing next to her as a Native American or a Native American medicine man. When I was a tiny kid, lizards were another topic of intense interest to me. When I was a youngster, I went to Florida every summer because my dad is from that state, and while I was there, I would try to collect small lizards outside. This is not an unusual occurrence. I was the winner of a poetry contest when I was in high school before my NDE, but I never pursued it. I also had an interest in filmmaking and attended a class called Communications in college with the intention of becoming a filmmaker before my lung collapsed. I was also a singer in a band, and my bandmates used to tell me that my voice sounded like it came from the Doors, even though I had never heard of them. All of these were areas in which Jim Morrison excelled and in which he participated. I was also informed that Jim passed away on July 3, 1971, due to complications associated with heart failure. Even before I had my NDE, so I know it's not something I've conjured up on my own. I always get sick on or around July 3rd divided by 4th. As was indicated earlier, I also have difficulties with my heart, and I have lung problems. After doing research on near-death experiences and former lives, I've arrived to the conclusion that because I've had these ailments ever since I was a child, they must have been carried over from a previous existence. I have never partaken in drugs, drinking, or smoking. Despite this, I have issues with my lungs and heart, which I feel are a form of karmic payback for the abuse that my body endured at the hands of those substances in the past. In addition, when I was a little child, my family traveled to Florida and ate at a restaurant called Morrison's. On the way home, as I was riding in the back seat of the car, I blurted out that Morrison was my last name. My parents were quick to correct me when they realized my assumption, pointing out that since it isn't in this life, I couldn't have been more than 4 years old at the time. Another thing that I may discuss with you is the concept of soulmates. As a result of the research I carried out on the subject of Jim Morrison, I discovered that his true love passed away 3 years after he did. Ironically, when I was a little child, I had a little buddy who lived across the street from me who was 3 years younger than me and had red hair. We spent our childhoods together and spent the first 7 years of my life together. After we were both 7 years old, we moved apart from each other and didn't see each other again until we were 17. After that, we went our separate ways. As soon as I saw images of Jim with his soul partner Pam Corson, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that my best buddy from my childhood was also my soulmate in the hereafter, simply because of this fact and their similarity. I haven't had any contact with her in the 8 to 9 years since just before the time of my near-death experience, and I think it's in both of our best interests to remain apart this time around so that we can experience greater spiritual development. In conclusion, I have a lot to say about what I've learned, how I battle with this information, and why at this moment in my life I have a peaceful life to ponder, which is why I became sick. I try to look at this situation as a learning opportunity, and while I do believe that, if I put my mind to it, I might emerge victorious from it, there is a part of me that still believes there is something I can get from being in these conditions. If I could restore my health and build a healthier body, I could fulfill my current aspiration to amuse others and talk about my thoughts, but in doing so, I would simply live out the same experiences I've already had, and I wouldn't advance in any way.